Hello and welcome back to another edition of Monster Gourmet, Fantastic Beasts and How to Eat Them. Today we're going to be making one of my favorites, beholder eye pie. So in order to make beholder eye pie, you will need flour, sugar, salt, shortening, butter, vodka, water, potato starch, pears, a lime, some crystallized ginger, nutmeg, and allspice. So if beholder eyes are not available in your area or beholders aren't in season, you can substitute pears. That's what we'll be doing today. Sort of have a similar texture and look. Check out that leer. There's sort of two components when you're making any pie. First of all, you've got to put together the crust. We'll be doing a lattice top crust for this pie, and I'll talk about why later. And then we'll do the actual filling. So the crust is a bit of a process. It takes some time in the refrigerator, so we will be doing that first. Pie crust can be a tricky business. Everybody will tell you that pie crust is one of the most difficult things they can do. I personally disagree. Pie crust it's a baking thing, which means it's going to be more of a science, more of a high precision experiment than any sort of cooking, right? Where you're just like tossing stuff into a pot on the stove. That's an art, this is a science. So I've got my scale here, and I'll just measure out flour. So we're looking for 2.5 cups of flour. That works out to 12.5 ounces. This is all-purpose flour. Okay, so to this flour, we will add a couple tablespoons of sugar. These are optional. I like to use this for a sweet pie. For a more savory pie, I'll sort of do what I'm feeling. So 2 tablespoons of sugar. And finally, teaspoon of salt. Whisk these together, get a nice mix going. Okay, and now we add our fat. So, the way we're going to do our fats, we will use this. This is a pastry cutter. You can pick one up at your local grocery store for not all that much money. If you're in a bind, you can use 2 forks and sort of go like this, but that's not a very fun process. It'll take you a lot longer. So we've got our shortening. So it's 1/2 cup of shortening, and this is 3/4 cup of butter, which is like 1.5 sticks. And this is unsalted butter, by the way. I always use unsalted butter when I'm cooking, because that allows me to control the salt content directly. If you don't have unsalted butter around, I believe it's about 3/8 of a teaspoon of salt for a stick of butter. All right, and now we take our pastry cutter and we cut in our fats and get into nice little chunks. Mix it in with that flour, sugar, and salt. And the situation we're looking for is basically no big blobs. We want it to be the granularity of coarse sand. So you combine the two. You use a little bit more butter than you do shortening, and then you get that nice butter flavor and a beautiful flaky shortening texture. And I'll tell you, there's nothing I love more in this world than a good flaky pie crust. So this is us getting there. But you can see there are still some pretty big blobs that we could break up. So just apply ourselves a little bit more, and you're going for sort of a twisting motion every time you cut it. And you don't have to worry about like over mixing this or anything like that. We don't have any water in this. There's nothing for the gluten and the flour to react with. So you can see that's just about the texture you're looking for. So next we add our liquids. So I've got 1/4 cup of water, and to it I will add 1/4 cup of vodka. The trick is that the alcohol in the vodka will bake off in the oven, right? So it's not like I'm going to have alcoholic pie crust. That'd be sort of silly. But what I will have is a pie crust with a much lower moisture content than I would have otherwise. And that means that I can actually bump the moisture content up now and have a more pliable, workable crust, a more pliable, workable dough than I would otherwise. And then all of that moisture will just burn off in the oven. So we'll start with most of it. And we use the rest of it. And here you do want to be careful not to mix it too terribly much. You want to make sure that you get a good mix. But now, because we've added water, the gluten will start to develop, and that will cause our pie crust to get like gummy and chewy, which is not what you want in a pie crust. So take it easy here, don't go overboard. So you'll note this is a fair bit stickier and wetter than a standard pie crust. If you've used Betty Crocker or America's Test Kitchen and you know their recipe well, this should look a little bit wet to you. But I assure you, things will be all right. Okay. What we'll do now, we'll take our cling wrap, separate it into 2 balls. It was a little wetter than I wanted it, maybe. It's all right, we'll just add flour. I talk about all this high precision, but like things like humidity and barometric pressure and temperature outside all play a pretty major factor in determining how your pie crust is going to turn out. So at some point you just have to have some tribal knowledge. The reason that we stick it in the fridge is twofold. First of all, the dough will be easier to work with. It'll be more pliable and more doing what we want when it's cold. And second of all, giving it a half an hour to rest will let the moisture sort of percolate throughout the dough, and that'll give it a nice, even consistency, which will also make it easier to work with. So it's 3:15, so at 3:45 we will commence.
2,000 years later.
So our next step is we are going to roll out the top crust, and we're going to roll it out into a big rectangle, and then we're going to freeze it. And that will allow us to, in a little bit, when the rest of the pie is ready to go, we'll use a pizza cutter to slice it into strips and make a lattice top out of it. So start with a good amount of flour, and I'm using a small plastic cutting board here. And then take one of your balls of dough out. I know I said cut it in half, but use a smaller one if there's a smaller one. And then we're just going to flour this nicely. Okay, and then we flour up our rolling pin and just go to town. And note how light and pliable our crust is here, this dough. That's because we've got so much extra moisture from the vodka, it ends up being very flexible, very easy to work with. That's good. So now you take your pizza cutter and just trim the edge. Whatever leftovers you have. We'll add this into the next bit that we roll out. And this goes into the freezer. So our next step is to start working with our pears. So for each of them, we'll wash it, we'll peel it, we'll slice it up, and we'll put it into that bowl over there. So start with your pear, peel the sticker off. This one doesn't have one. And then I just use a potato peeler. So these are d'Anjou pears, which are presumably some sort of French, I don't know. You can use pretty much any sort of pear you want for this. D'Anjous are nice because they're large, they have a lot of meat to them. But I also really like Bosch pears in this recipe. They have a nice, like, sort of spiciness to them that the more mellow d'Anjou will not. Okay, so put your pear there, take your knife, and we're just gonna chop the sucker. Start by quartering it, and then I usually just chop out the core just like that. And be careful with your knife work here. If you slice off all your fingers, it is not my fault. So this recipe is more or less based on an apple pie recipe. But pears are a fair bit juicier than apples. Now, because these pears will be so juicy, we're actually going to leave them in relatively large chunks. These are a little bit bigger than you would get if you were doing an apple pie, or at least bigger than I usually do when I'm doing an apple pie. Bear that in mind as you're doing your work here.
Bear that in mind.
Get out of here. Right now is probably about when you want to set your oven. Make sure that that bottom rack has tons of space on top of it. Put the baking sheet in. So we'll preheat it to 500. Once it's there and we've got all of our filling and our pie assembled, we will put that in and immediately drop the temperature. That plus the already hot baking sheet underneath will help get our crust crisp and flaky without, and then the fact that we drop the temperature will help us prevent overdoing it on the rest of the pie. So we've got our pears sliced. They're looking real good there in the bowl. Now we need to add some stuff to them so that they're even better than they were before. We're going to start with some sugar. And we're going to do about half a cup. And then the next thing we'll add is potato starch. So I'm using potato starch as a thickener here. So we'll do about a quarter of a cup of this. And that will soak up some of that juice as it is released. We'll do some salt, quarter teaspoon or so. We'll take a lime, slice it, and just all that juice right into here. And that acidity will help things sort of break down and meld together and give it a nice little bit of punch. Okay, so next, our crystallized ginger. We've got about half a cup here. Scatter that in. And finally, nutmeg and allspice. So nutmeg, just a bit. Allspice, just a bit more. And as you do this, the pears will start to release juices, and that should get soaked up by that sugar and the potato starch. And this is where experience starts to come into play. You have to sort of eyeball it and say, oh, is this too juicy? Is this not juicy enough? This is probably right about where I want it to be. Next step, we're going to roll out our bottom layer of crust. So I've got my pie dish at the ready. Plenty of flour here to work with. And of course, pie dough. Using clean hands here, of course, you would never reach into the flour dish with dirty hands. What's wrong with you? Nice circle. Okay, let me just roll this out nice and gentle. And note how pliable this is, right? How easy it is to work with this crust. So what we're looking for here is at least 2 inches further outside of the pie dish than the diameter of it, which we have. So now we need to transfer this into that. And the way I do it, this is the way that my mother taught me, is you just fold it over, fold it over. Mm-hmm. There we go. And make sure it's nice and even with the bottom of the pie dish there. And then our next step is we're going to actually fold whatever extra we've got over, and we will reinforce the walls of the pie. Just sort of fold it over. And you don't want the walls to be too terribly thick, right? You still want to have some space for pie in there. But really focusing on that curve where it drops into the bottom of the pie, that's what we want to make sure is in good state here. So, bottom crust is ready to go. Now, we add our filling. So you just spoon it in. To just make sure that gets spread around nice and even. Okay, and you want to end up with the top of the pie being basically flat. That's about where you want it to be. And that will allow us to lay the lattice top over the top and not have it be all humpy and goopy. So we pull out our sheet of frozen pie crust. So you'll need a ruler for this next step. And your pizza cutter, of course. And I like to start, go ahead and figure out how wide you've got it. So this is about 10 inches. So that means our strips are going to be, we're going to make 8 strips, which means they're each going to be 1.25 inches wide. So we'll start at the 5-inch mark and just like lay one down. Start at 5, 2.5, 1.25, 3 3/4, 7.5, 6.25, and 8 3/4. Cool. So now we've got even marks. I've never had these not stick at least a little, no matter how well I flour the cutting board. And then just start laying them down. And I like to do the center ones first. And make sure you are lifting up the correct ones so you do actually get a lattice and not just like Some strips going some way over, some other strips going the other way. And now we form the outer lip of the crust. And you do that just by sort of pressing and folding these over, and you're trying to get the lattice to attach to the bottom layer. Then we're coming around to the end here, and you just sort of force it to line up. And then I always go around and sort of push down on it just a little bit, just enough to make it not be all pointy. We're going to use a little bit of egg white and dress up the top of this. Separating an egg, super easy. You don't need any special tools. Just crack it, and then you just do this. Sort of back and forth, tossing the yolk and letting the white drain off. We'll put the yolk elsewhere. And we'll add just a pinch of salt to this. Beat it a bit. And just get all of the pieces of crust. So one question you might have is, why am I using a lattice top pie here instead of going for a more traditional closed top pie? Especially if this is based on an apple pie recipe. An apple pie recipe is almost always going to be a closed top pie, not a lattice. And the answer to that is, the first time I made it, the pears broke down so much and they released so much juice that the pie crust actually ended up being sort of soggy, which is not what I wanted. So I both increased the amount of potato starch that I added, and I used the lattice top pie, and the lattice top pie allows for much more ventilation, and that results in a less watery pie. Take some sugar, and just nice and easy. So this combination of egg white and sugar will give it a nice glazed look on the top. It'll make an absolutely beautiful crust, and we'll see that when it comes up. So now we put it into the oven. 500 degrees is hot, so be careful. And you pull this open. And just set it on that tray. Button it back up. And immediately, don't forget this step, turn the temperature down. 425 is our goal here. And you're going to leave it in at 425 for 25 minutes. So you leave it in the oven at 425 for about 25 minutes. And then, as soon as that timer goes off, we will, without opening the oven, without letting any heat escape, turn down the temperature again to 375. This will basically stop browning the crust, or stop browning it quite so fast, but allow the internals of the pie, that delicious fruit, to break down, release more juice. And we'll do that for 30 to 35 minutes. And again, this is a place where you sort of have to eyeball it. You have to say, well, how do I think these individual pieces of fruit are doing? What is going on with the bubbles and the, like, what I can see of how the pie is, and just what am I feeling? So 30 to 35 minutes after we've turned down the temperature a second time, and then it comes out. Once it is out of the oven, you want to put it on a wire rack to cool, preferably somewhere where there's a cross breeze, like on a windowsill. And you're going to leave it there for at least a few hours. So it needs to cool completely, all the way to room temperature before you slice into it. Otherwise, it will just be a giant, gross mess. If you let it cool, that will let it set, and then your pie pieces will hold up really nicely when you serve them.